What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. William Shakespeare uses this line in his play Romeo and Juliet to convey that the naming of things is irrelevant. In 2021, the NCIP issued an en banc resolution condemning the use of the word Lumad to refer to Indigenous people from Mindanao due to its heavy association with red tagging. Claiming that this was meant for their protection and instead people should refer to them by their individual identities as they so rightly deserved, this begs several questions. What does this mean for the Lumad themselves? And who has the authority to choose a name, and what does it mean? I'm Sandra Bravo, and I invite you to join me as I uncover what the word Lumad really means, and if it can ever truly be defined.
But first, a little bit of history as to the plight of Indigenous people. The podcast Contested Philippine History sheds light on the matter. The people who succeeded not to be colonized outright are the same people who are being abused not just by the government but by much of Philippine society. Who are Indigenous people? Well, we refer to the upland and lowland ethno-linguistic groups who have not been colonized or absorbed by centuries of colonization in the Philippines. Why? Either because of location or the desire to be free from colonizers and to remain in their ancestral lands, which pushed them to resist. They weren't interested to become Catholics. During American colonization, they were then referred to as non-Christian tribes, or NCTs, and the largest of which came from the Moros of Mindanao in Sulu. It was apparent what the U.S. interest was in the Philippines. It was to exploit the resources. And as to where they were going to do that, it was in the places untouched by the Spaniards. The Jones Law was then enacted, which expanded the colonial interest. It mentioned that immigration into Mindanao and Sulu and investment on their fertile regions were encouraged, with Mindanao as their biggest potential. Even during the granting of Philippine independence, RA 1888 was enacted, and NCTs were called National Cultural Minorities. The goal was to integrate them to a major part of Philippine society. In 1997, IPRA was enacted, and it changed the way we saw Indigenous people, but it still wasn't perfect. Before, the goal was integration, and now it was the respect of rights, respect of the right to remain Indigenous and to protect their identities and livelihood. What's sad, however, is the continued attack on IP rights. It's already the 21st century and much of the country is still unaware of its cultural diversity. Even in the academe, they become laboratory things about their culture and not even giving back to the community about the impact of their research, which is what the podcast referred to as research fatigue.
Professor Ulindang in the NCCA defined Lumad as a Visayan term meaning native or indigenous. It is short for Katauhang Lumad, which literally means indigenous people, which is officially adopted by the delegates of the Lumad Mindanao People's Federation. It is adopted by a group of 15 from more than 18 Mindanao ethnic groups in their Cotabato Congress in June 1986 to distinguish them from other Mindanaoans, Moro or Christian. Its usage was accepted during the Cory administration when, in RA 6734, the word Lumad was used in Article 13, Section 8, Paragraph 2 to distinguish these ethnic communities from the Bangsamoro. The choice of a Cebuano word was slightly ironic, though, but they did consider it as the most appropriate as the Lumad tribes do not have any other common language except Cebuano. This was the first time in their history that these tribes agreed to have a common name for themselves, different from the Moros and from the migrant majority. It was spurred on by a political awakening among tribes, and at present, Mindanao Lumads account for 2.1 million out of 6.5 million indigenous people nationally. In 1997, the National Commission on Indigenous People was created with the goal of protecting the rights of indigenous people in the Philippines. Fast forward to 2021, the NCIP issued an en banc resolution denouncing the use of the word Lumad due to its association with rebel groups. It was claimed that it was done for the safety of the Visayan indigenous people and communities, and said that many leaders have clamored to sever from this negative association. It meant to protect the indigenous people and communities. It also claimed that instead of calling them Lumad, it was best to refer to them only as their specific indigenous groups' names, and never Lumad. But what did experts, the academe, and most importantly, the impacted indigenous people themselves had to say about it? During my research, I was able to find 2 roundtable discussions held over Zoom that was uploaded to YouTube to know what anthropologists and indigenous leaders had to say. And here's what I've gathered. Lumad isn't even that heavy a word. In fact, it's a word that they don't even use among themselves, but instead the more convenient term for outsiders such as myself to easily identify them, or to call them. If it could have been another word, perhaps not much would be changed. So, what makes it special? Well, according to Datolito Omos, the ready-made terminology is not appropriate to apply to all tribes in Mindanao, as it is being related with the CPP or the NPA. There should be an acknowledgement of a tribe's own history and identity. However, according to Jimid Mansayagan, there should be no suggestion of CPP-NPA relation to the origins of the use of the word Lumad. This is from the 1994 Lumad Mindanao Federation and the 1986 Founding Assembly of Lumad Mindanao. They had a long debate on what is the collective identity of Mindanaoan indigenous people. According to Timuay and Tami Mansayagan, Lumad is a Visayan term, and the context of this is that it is a common understanding of different communities in Mindanao who are not Muslimized. And the global context of this is the united aspiration of the Lumad to survive, but the problem that they face is propensity, thinking that others are superior to them and have the power to impose upon them their identities. We remember that this was how education started. People were forced to speak English and go to school, and if they spoke their own language, they would face a penalty. According to Gaskat Maitan, it is all in a matter of context or use. A blanket condemnation of Lumad ignores the fact of a collective Pan-Mindanao identity and historical experience. According to him, the resolution supposedly decries how the name Lumad is not an indigenous term. However, there is already no Mindanao indigenous term for the Aboriginal peoples of the island, taken as a group. The resolution does offer alternative terminology, but these are all in English or Filipino and Tagalog. Lumad may be a Visayan term, but at least it doesn't recall our colonial subjugation or reiterate the political and cultural dominance of Imperial Manila. More importantly, it was the indigenous communities of Mindanao themselves who gradually adopted or appropriated the name Lumad as a way of asserting a shared identity or location. In other words, they have made it their own. And if you remember, the historical experience in the struggle of the Lumad is to restore their collective dignity and identity against colonial tendency that always imposed on them. Indigenous leaders in communities across Mindanao who, until the late 70s, had been relatively isolated from each other, realized that they shared histories of displacement, violence, and discrimination. They faced a common set of problems, and similarly, they aspired to have recognition and development. These shared characteristics provide for the basis for a collective identity, an identity that over time they chose to refer to as Lumad. As members of marginalized groups, these leaders and advocates could not force other people, groups, or communities to do the same. But over the succeeding 40 years, other indigenous organizations and communities all across Mindanao have similarly adopted or used the word Lumad. This suggests that with our growing links to the political, economic, and cultural mainstream, more and more indigenous communities and organizations have also begun to think of themselves not as isolated communities, but as part of the indigenous peoples of Mindanao, taken as a group. This is the beginning of a pan-Mindanao indigenous consciousness, and what Carl Gaspar calls the Lumad social movement. Upon researching, I also asked myself, if we started calling indigenous people and communities Lumad, are we erasing their individual identities? Gaskat Maitan again answers, while it is true that there are no territories under the name of Lumad, this proves nothing. The name Lumad was not intended to replace the various endonyms of indigenous peoples of Mindanao, nor is it used in that way. Members of indigenous peoples or communities know that they are Tiboli, for example, and that their domains and territories belong to them as members of the Tiboli people, not as Lumad. So it's not surprising then that they claim their ancestral domains as Tiboli. So, no, calling them Lumad as a collective and their individual identities are not mutually exclusive. As for my personal resolution, Dr. Una Parada was correct. Whose opinion does it matter the most, if not communities directly affected by this denunciation? The Lumad themselves. According to them, to be an indigenous person in our society is to be forced to advocate for yourself and your community on a daily basis for the most basic things. It shouldn't be interpreted as political activism when it is really just basic survival and the exercise of one's basic rights as a citizen. Over the course of my research, I then came to realize why this 3-page NCIP resolution is such a big deal. It wasn't so much so as having a name taken away from a community, but having a collective identity being erased by actions of groups with nothing to do with them. It was violating their identities, which they welcomed since their agreement in the 1980s. It was erasing an important part of history and replacing it with hasty generalizations. The government through the NCIP, to me, was defensive in its denunciation. If it was true to its mandate of uplifting the voices and needs of Indigenous people and communities, then it would have cited and protected the collective Pan-Mindanao identities of the Lumad instead of putting the burden of red tagging solely on them. I recall the words of Dr. Cherubim Quizon, "This is the result of our laws, but we have to remember that the law is a movable wall that reflects the society that it serves." These types of discussions are very welcome. These reflect how the laws serve or fail to serve our society, including the Indigenous people. They are also who the nation hopes to serve. So, what is in a name? And who decides what they're called? By now, we should have realized that this power belongs not to the NCIP, but to our Indigenous people and communities. Father Cillian from the University of San Carlos was right. It is strange that the real interpretation of the name is placed in a new context which the Lumad themselves did not cause to create.